Ja, ich vermute, wir können wir dürfen starten. Sehr geehrter Herr Mesgener, Vizekonsul von Äthiopien, sehr geehrter Herr Dr. Meyer-Wegeling, Vizepräsident Herr Lutz Bachmann, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Freundinnen und Freunde, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and an honor to introduce Dr. Souleymane Bachir Diagne, our Adolf Elegard Jensen Gedächtnis Vorlesungslecturer for 2015. Herr Professor Caroline Kohl, the director of Frobenius Institute, would have done this with great pleasure, but as you know, he is currently in Brazil. So, Herr Dr. Meyer-Wegeling, please allow me to introduce Mr. Diagne. Souleymane Bachir Diagne is professor at Columbia University in the Department of French and Romance Philology and Department of Philosophy. Souleymane, this is how we call him at home. Americans call him Bashir. Souleymane is a product of two schools, the Senegalese and the Western. After attending high school, Souleymane entered Louis-le-Grand High School at home, Louis-le-Grand, the elite school par excellence in Paris. Then he studied at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris and carried out research at Harvard University, having been selected for an exchange program between Harvard and the École Normale Supérieure. He got his agrégation in philosophy, when he was only 22 years old. Then Souleymane completed his doctorate and his doctorat d'état at the Sorbonne University in Paris. Before reaching Columbia University, he held the chair of professor at Northwestern University in philosophy and religion and in the program of African studies. He joined the United States of America from the University of Dakar, where he served as professor of philosophy, inspector general of teaching of philosophy in Senegal, and as vice dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities of the Cheikh Anta University in Dakar. Souleymane is member of several scientific institutions. Let me just pick a couple of them. The International Scientific Committee of Diogène, a journal of philosophy and social sciences published in Paris by the International Council of Philosophy and Social Science with the support of UNESCO. He is a member of the International Institute of Philosophy, member of the Steering Committee of the International Federation of Philosophical Society. He received a number of distinctions and awards from Senegal, from France, and from the United States of America. Souleymane is a genuine guy from the Sahel. He speaks French, English, Wolof, reads Latin, Greek, and Arabic. Maybe he started speaking German because I saw him yesterday starting to talk a couple of stuff. I don't know which one, but it was in German. So he's a typical Sahelian guy. He published extensively indeed. Let me mention 14 single-authored books, among them The Cultural Question in Africa, a dictionary of notion, personalities, dates, and places to explain Islam, Islam and Open Society, African Art as Philosophy, etc., etc. He co-authored several volumes and special issues of journals. Allow me not to get into details of these. Gorgi, floor is yours.
Jërëjëf góor gi. Thank you very much, Mamadou, for this very kind and generous introduction. And thank you all for coming. You say this in German, but I understand that some official from Ethiopia is present, and I would like to salute them. And I express my deepest gratitude to the Frobenius Institute for inviting me to deliver these prestigious Jensen lectures. It's a real great honor for any academic, and I would add, especially for someone like me, a Senegalese scholar who has written something on Léopold Sédar Senghor, and you know that for Léopold Sédar Senghor, Leo Frobenius was some kind of African ancestor, let's say. And I would like to thank in particular Professor Cole, and again thank my good friend Mamadou Diawara, Professor Diawara, for giving me really this extraordinary opportunity. And I cannot thank enough Astrid Hundish, Maurice, and everybody in the Frobenius Institute who have really managed to make my journey, my travel here, smooth and easy. And I would like to thank the whole Institute for the wonderful hospitality I've been receiving ever since I became a Frankfurter, speaking some German. And I just learned from our colleague Susanna that actually you even ordered the weather. So I appreciate that. Let me now start by saying a few words to present the 7 lectures that I will have the pleasure of giving every Monday, starting today, every Monday evening until June 8, 2015. I am interested in examining the notion of interculturality through the concept of translation. This is banal. So it means that I am understanding the concept of translation very broadly, even if at its heart are languages in their plurality. I insist on the fact that my point of departure is always the plurality of languages out there, all of them equivalent. So I will consider what I call different scenes of translation corresponding to each of my lectures. They are situations of encounter between cultures and language. And ethnology, obviously, is familiar with such scenes. So in my lectures 2 and 3, I will consider the scenes presenting interpreters such as Amadou Hampâté-Bâ, the Malian, in the colonial situation. I will argue in those lectures that the interpreter in colonial situation is not really a translator, because I would like to understand translator following French philosophers Antoine Berman or Paul Ricoeur as a relationship of reciprocity, which occurs only between languages that are considered to be equivalent. This is my credo, my creed, if you wish, in presenting these lectures. And this is obviously not the case when we have a language of administration and domination encountering the indigenous languages. So the interpreter will become a translator when he or she expands his role, the role he undertakes by his role by undertaking the task of writing his or her own oral tradition, and thus reinventing himself or herself somehow as a creator. So that is the move I wish to make from scene 2 to scene 3, moving from interpretation, colonial interpretation, to what I would call post-colonial translation. In scene 4, I consider what is called in Latin translatio studii. I have to speak Latin now that you have enumerated all these complicated languages. Translatio studii or studiorum, referring to the movement by which Greek philosophy was translated and appropriated by the Islamic world starting in the 9th century. What I am interested in looking at that particular history is the fact that such a translatio studiorum actually concerned also African centers of learning. So the translatio studiorum from Athens to Baghdad, which is classical, or to Cordoba, if we consider the southern Spain, which was also Islamic, also led to Timbuktu, hence my title, From Athens to Baghdad to Timbuktu. And I would argue in that lecture that this was very important for African indigenous languages in West Africa. Scene 5 is centered around the political, theological question of the translation of the sacred language, particularly in Islam. It is never a simple thing to consider the translation of the Word of God. I would say that in particular in Islam, there are theological and political issues that I would like to consider, and consider in particular a translation which exists, which is not yet published, of the Quran in Wolof. And the issues related to that are going to be the issues I want to explore in scene 5. Now, scene 6 and 7 will be devoted to the question of universality, which is posed, of course, when we start with the actual plurality of equivalent languages, which I said is my starting point, when no particular language could pretend to be the spoken word of the universal. If nobody naturally speaks, or no language naturally speaks the logos or speaks the universal, then we would consider that the only possible universal in our post-colonial world is a universal of translation. This is going to be my final conclusion in scene 7. I would raise then the question of the implications for the universality of human rights of such a landscape of plural languages. And this is a question I raise in scene 6 through an examination of the philosophical discussions that led to the adoption of the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. So this is the general arc that this series of lectures will describe, and I hope that you will accompany its movement by coming again, even if I don't have the support of a reception after, as I hope to turn everything I just presented into a book for which I will very much value your help and your contributions. So now on radical translation. All the scenes that I have described from 2 to 7 correspond to precise historical situations of translation, except the one that I'm now going to present, which is, as we will see, rather an ideal representation of intercultural relation, what is called a thought experiment. The reason for that is that it will allow me to examine philosophically the concepts that are going to be important for me when speaking of translation as interculturality, that is reciprocity and equivalence, as opposed to asymmetry and domination, asymmetry of imperial languages versus dominated languages, or sacred languages versus profane languages. The ethical meaning of translation, and in particular, the commitment to humanism that translation implies. That ideal general first scene of translation is an encounter between a representative of a given culture and language, say an ethnologist who is also a linguist, and a native whose language and culture have absolutely no common ground with what the ethnologist has ever experienced in his life. Some of you familiar with the classics of the history of philosophy recognize in this thought experiment and in the very title of my lecture, presenting the discovery of a supposedly untouched culture, the scene that was imagined by the logician and philosopher Willer van Orman Quine as a situation of radical translation, a phrase which is probably the most famous and most discussed concept of Quine. The thought experiment is first presented at length in chapter 2 of his book, Word and Object. And radical translation is a natural beginning for my own project because it poses the question of the very possibility of interculturality. Simply put, the question it asks is everything human translatable for every human being, or do pluralities of human cultures necessarily entail the impossibility of any transcultural meaning? To see what is at stake, we can look at the controversies that have surrounded the so-called post-colonial studies in France in particular, the strong reaction of many French intellectuals against what they call post-colonial studies because they believe that post-colonial studies is the destruction of any possibility of universality. It is the destruction of any possibility for any given enunciation to actually circulate among different cultures and languages, let alone be appropriated universally. And so this shows what is at stake here. So one way of describing such a word of which these intellectuals opposing post-colonial studies are afraid would be to describe it as the reign of the untranslatable. You would have a word which would be totally fragmented between languages and cultures that cannot be translated into one another. On that question, ethnology, which I consider here, forgive me that definition, that very quick definition, as the science of the other languages and cultures, offers, I believe, two opposite answers, presents two different faces that the notion of radical translation will help me think. One face of ethnology as what I call then a colonial discipline of othering the other would be a face of radical dissymmetry and untranslatability. And another face would be characterized as the post-colonial or anti-colonial ethnology, which would be then founded on an ethics or a humanism of reciprocity and translation. These are the two faces of ethnology I'm going to present and discuss with you. But first, let me just summarize very quickly for those of you who are not familiar with this classical text, what radical translation is. Let there be a situation in which a linguist seeks to recover, I quote, a man's current language from his currently observed responses to stimuli in the absence of any interpreter. What makes the translation attempted by this linguist radical, Quine explains, is that he has to penetrate and translate a language which is hitherto unknown. Unknown being understood in a very absolute, in some absolute sense. For Quine says, I may know Frisian, but that language and English are kindred languages, so translation from one into the other is just aided by resemblance of cognate word forms. That is one example. And I believe the example of Frisian would be speaking particularly to you Germans. And in the case of unrelated languages, such as Hungarian and English, translation can still be, said Quine, aided by traditional equations that have evolved in step with a shared culture. But here, in the thought experiment constructed by Quine, the situation of translation is reduced to its simplest naked state, a language with no connection to anything I know and the reactions of one of its speakers when he is stimulated by certain events that we both observe. That is all I have. What is presented is a very realistic situation corresponding to this ideal type of experience of encountering a hitherto untouched population. So the language of ethnology is very quickly and very naturally the one adopted by Quine, as he speaks of the linguist ethnographer and of the native as an informant, who then informs the explorer about his language that Quine calls jungle. So here is a native speaking jungle, being an informant for a radical translator who is going to put into form what the raw material brought by the informant. So all that is available to him in this task as translator are, on the one hand, the stimuli, everything that happens. On the other hand, the verbal and behavioral response to them by the native. The well-known starting point is the apparition of a rabbit scurrying by, says Quine, and triggering the utterance by the native of the sound gavagai. This is, Quine is associated to gavagai, just like Descartes is associated to I think, therefore I am. Now, gavagai can mean different things connected to the rabbit in question, so the linguist needs to elicit from his informant responses as adequate as possible to his own interrogations and hypotheses by provoking him to produce the two contrary verbal or bodily and/or bodily expressions that would translate unequivocally as assent or yes, dissent or no. Something I need absolutely to know is how this person is going to say yes or no. So I cannot rely upon bodily language because I cannot assume that the bodily language to say yes or the bodily language to say no is universal. And Quine gives the counterexample. I believe he considered that the Turks might say this for no. I know that Iranians sometimes do this for no. I have an Iranian friend who does that. So we cannot trust bodily language. But you can do the questions and answers in such a way that you end up determining what for the native corresponds to yes and what corresponds to no. And once he has yes and no, our radical translator can envision the possibility of translating compounds where you would find connectives such as and or but, or the unary, very important connective. We call it connective, although it is just on one sentence, the negation, not. And of course, in logic, if you have the negation and any of these other connectives, you can have all the possible way of compounding, of making compounds. So by collating the situations that command the native's assent to the compounds with the situations that command assent to the components, and similarly for dissent, the linguist can get a plausible line on such connectives. Of course, he will also have, you cannot just reconstruct a language step by step like that. At one point, he will have to make analytical hypotheses and do very often, I quote Quine, extravagant guessworks. As he reaches higher and more conjectural levels, he will continue to use the invaluable routine of query and assent that had been his standby in construing observation sentences. So I need not go into the details of Quine's construction of a manual of translation. What is important here would be the following remarks. First remark, to recall that the point of departure of Quine's whole approach is that there is not such a thing as an independent meaning that would be transcendent and out there, that every single language just aims at and grasps. If that is the case, translation would just be a matter of synonymy. You look at what is the meaning, the transcendent meaning, which is grasped by your language, and you look at the way in which that same transcendent meaning is grasped, aimed at, and grasped by another language. So you try to find what the equivalence is. And in refusing that kind of situation, actually Quine is breaking away from a long tradition of philosophers / logicians who did believe precisely in something common and universal in all languages, that logic is exhuming, that true logic is exhuming. In other words, if we ask if the same thought could be grasped and expressed in different languages, and when a logician like Frege answers yes, he is continuing a long line of tradition dating back from someone like Leibniz, for example, who considered that logic, which is a language of our understanding, the language by which if our understanding spoke without interference from our imagination or our passions, etc., we would be understanding each other perfectly well. You would be just listening to me as if I was speaking German, if only my understanding was speaking. Now, the language of that understanding is supposed to be logic. So it means that logic in this tradition of thought is actually some kind of kernel that one finds inside every given language. And this would be the trace in each of our languages of this Adamic language that we used to speak before the catastrophe of Babel, before God in his wrath destroyed our tower and sent us all around the world, even in Senegal, and dispersed us with tongues that would not be understood by everybody. We had this Adamic language, and the belief that logic is retrieving the Adamic language is precisely what Quine is here breaking from. He breaks away from a commonly held belief that the Adamic kernel behind the variety of human languages would be actually the foundation for any translation. Now, if I leave the field of logic and philosophy, well, not philosophy, I can't, but logic, in this case, the field of logic, and transfer this into the field of the philosophy of translation and the metaphysics of translation, as Walter Benjamin, for example, developed it. This could be, there is a counterpart of this notion of an Adamic language captured by logic in what Walter Benjamin has called the pure language, the reine Sprache, to continue to pretend speaking German. So this idea that the task of the translator is to look beyond the profusion of empirical languages for the pure language that every language bears within itself as its messianic echo, here I am quoting Benjamin, is the counterpart of what I just described on the logical side. For an empiricist and a behaviorist such as Quine, obviously, translation could certainly not be a process of superseding the empirical in order to reach the ideal or some kind of Platonic pre-Babel or Adamic lingua humana. On the contrary, and that is the second remark I'm making, radical translation only leads to the acknowledgement of indeterminacy of translation, as Quine called it, expressed as follows, and here I quote Quine at length. These reflections leave us little reason to expect that two radical translators working independently on jungle, the language jungle, would come out with interchangeable manuals of translations. Their manuals might be indistinguishable in terms of any native behavior that they give reason to expect, and yet each manual might prescribe some translations that the other translator would reject. Such is the thesis of the indeterminacy of translation. In other words, the result would be this: two radical translators meeting two different natives in two different settings, speaking that same jungle language, would establish a manual of translation which predicts perfectly well what is going to be the behavior of the native. If you pronounce gavagai, he would start thinking of eating a rabbit, etc. But at the same time, the two manuals could be different, and even very different. They would refer to the same behavioral answers, but in themselves, they might be quite different. And Quine has a very nice point here, anticipating somehow Alta Vista. He says that by perversion, if I translate English into one, using one of the manual, and then translate it back with the other manual, I could have surprises, which is what happens if you use Alta Vista. You translate one language into some other language, and you try to come back, you might find out something about something totally different from what your question initially was. So one question that is posed, and which is what interests me here in this discussion of radical translation: how can I assume that the native I am talking to, because I try not to assume anything, to really start from scratch, but how can I assume that actually he and I share the same logic? That he would give me, the answer he gives me to something today would be the same answer he would give me tomorrow if I pose the same question, etc., etc. In other words, the simple fact that he is dealing with me using a principle of identity, using the so-called laws of thought, principle of identity, principle of non-contradiction, or principle of excluded middle. Or should I say that actually he and I do not share the same language that I know, but do not share even the same logic? And here in this question are what I have called the two faces of ethnology. The ethnologist has to make the decision as to the reality of a shared logic. It is not a result of his translation, but it is the very principle and foundation of that translation. So one possibility is that he decide pre-logicality of the native or alter logicality. That is the direction I have called colonial ethnology of the untranslatable. And its best representative, obviously, as you know better than me, is Lucien Lévy-Bruhl. The other possibility, the logic of the linguist, is undoubtedly founded upon the law of excluded middle, so there are only these two possibilities, is the decision expressing an ethics of translation, a decision to establish the manual on the assumption that they do share the same logic, the ethnologist and the native. And that is the direction taken by Quine's philosophy, which then allows, in the word of French philosopher Sandra Lausier, a rapprochement with, in particular, Malinowski and Lévi-Strauss, and also a parallel with Wittgenstein, who share the same anthropological point of view on logic and knowledge. So now, more quickly, my point on ethnology as a colonial discipline of untranslatability. Quine addresses specifically Lévy-Bruhl's ethnology and his most famous thesis on the pre-logical nature of the primitive's mentality. Lévy-Bruhl's thesis represents the most extreme form of an ethnology which fragments humanity into humanities, between which there is radical untranslatability. No wonder that it revealed itself untenable, and that Lévy-Bruhl recanted later as we know, this thesis. What Quine's thought experiment of radical translation reminds us is that the thesis of prelogicity is precisely a decision made a priori and not something sustained by the actual experience and translation of the native's behavior. It is important, I believe, to remember that Lucien Lévy-Bruhl came to the thesis of primitive mentality as prelogical, not through ethnology, but first and foremost through philosophy and moral philosophy. He was interested in moral philosophy, and he was interested in making the point that you cannot have universal morality. Because on which foundation would you have a universal morality? You cannot have it upon the assumption that there is such a thing as a human nature, individual and social, always identical to itself in all times and all countries. I am here quoting Lévy-Bruhl. And interestingly, when he goes against that assumption, Lévy-Bruhl establishes a contrast between the Greeks, who defined humanity as synonymous with Greek, in opposition to the barbarians, and Christianity, which came to invent the notion of a humanity by erasing the difference between Romans and Greeks on the one hand, barbarians on the other hand, as it did between the chosen people and the Gentiles. And Lévy-Bruhl, in this earlier work in 1903, La morale et la science des mœurs, asks, rhetorically, didn't Adam drag along all men in his fall? Didn't Christ redeem them all? So, Lévy-Bruhl continues, the illusion was established that Christian humanity or humanity was roughly the same thing. So this equivalence between humanity and Christian humanity, which Lévy-Bruhl saw as the destruction of the fragmentation of humanity by the Greek, was for him a turning point in history. And St. Paul has been, in many recent books, celebrated as the inventor of universality. To that unquestioned and confused notion of one humanity, upon which the belief in a natural and universal ethics rests, Lévy-Bruhl wants to oppose what he believes are and will be more and more the positive findings of anthropology when we stop projecting our own logic upon the native's culture and language. In some respect, what Lévy-Bruhl would have said in the thought experiment described by Quine would be to tell the radical translator, beware, make sure that at one point you would not be projecting your own logic on the native. So when he came to work in the field of ethnology, having developed that relativist understanding of morality, Lévy-Bruhl already had the prejudice, and I'm using the word prejudice in the etymological meaning, he had already prejudged the infralogical nature of the native, and consequently, the absolute untranslatability of the primitive mentality into our language shaped by conceptual logic. To express it in the language of Quine, of the inscrutability of reference, that is, of the ontological commitments of the speakers of jungle. So what Lévy-Bruhl says is that we should be distinguishing three layers of logic. We do have a conceptual logic at the surface, and then under it, there is a logic of images. And under that, again, there is a logic of feelings. Later, when he gets interested in ethnology, he will conflate the two layers of logic into what he called primitive mentality, characterized by law of participation. Now, that is what I described as one direction that can be taken answering the question of radical translation, and that direction presents ethnology as what I have called the colonial discipline of the untranslatable. The other direction would, on the contrary, define ethnology in more positive way as what I would call then a post-colonial humanism of translation, of which I'm going to say a few words before I conclude. So Quine's position is neither the belief of logicians in the universal Adamic pure language of logic common to all human tongues, nor the Levi-Brullian ethnology of untranslatability. It can then be described as a bet, a wager on the rationality and the logic of the speakers of jungle. In fact, what he is doing is exactly what Levi-Bruhl was saying you should not be doing. He is saying we should project our logic upon the language of the native, upon jungle. That bet, that projection has a primarily ethical meaning, which led French philosopher Bruno Ambroise to read in it an advocacy for an ethics of translation in Quine's text. Thus, Quine considers simply that the notion of pre-logical people is simply a myth, and any apparent affirmation that the natives could hold a sentence of a form P and not P, to say that it is sunny and it is not sunny, if I come up with a translation like that, then this is simply the result not of the irrationality of the jungle speakers, but of bad translation. What Quine is saying, if an ethnologist comes and say, look, I found a people who would believe that P and not P could be true, you would say, oh, go back and check your dictionary and try your translation again. And on this point, Quine has a footnote in which he quotes Malinowski, who prevented the inhabitants of Triobrand Island from being accused of pre-logicity by changing his translation of terms in order to avoid contradiction. So not to attribute irrationality or a different logic to the jungle speaker and change instead any translation of what they said that would be a hint of irrationality is what is called for here. This projection of a logic as a condition for translation has been called principle of charity. Actually, the phrase was not coined by Quine, but by another philosopher, Neil Wilson, who called it principle of charity, as if you are, doing the charity to the native of believing that you share the same logic. In a situation like this, obviously, that expression, principle of charity, has something totally paternalistic and colonial. But actually, it is not Quine's expression. Also, he uses it. And sometimes you also find other names for it, principle of rational accommodation or principle of humanity. And in his later texts, Quine would use the notion of empathy, actually, for that, which clearly conveys such a meaning of a shared humanity as both a methodological principle and an ethical principle for translation. Two reasons to adopt this decision, if you are an ethnologist or a radical translator, because after all, why? Why would you bet on rationality rather than otherwise? The first reason, again, is that the conclusion in question was in fact an understood assumption right at the beginning, stemming from the decision to make the other a radical other. In other words, what Quine is saying is that you should understand that in your decision to make the other have a different logic, you are yourself fabricating strangeness because you are othering the other, and then what you find is only your own othering of the other. So the strangeness you find is something you have fabricated. And somehow this makes me think of the lesson of Montesquieu's Lettres persanes. I believe that this is a very important lesson when one likes to look at the ethnology of, at the epistemology of ethnology. What Montesquieu does is take Parisian society, well known, and make it totally foreign through the eyes of a Persian visiting, which means that actually we can make anything foreign. And this is the first reason why Quine is saying you should not go there along the line of prelogicity or alterlogicity, because you would be the one fabricating it. When you say, I am not projecting my logic upon the other, what you are doing actually is projecting your own fabrication of strangeness upon the other. The second important reason is that empathy is actually the way in which a child learns a language, his or her own maternal language. In other words, Quine at the end just says, you know what, the situation I have described of this radical translator translating jungle is not different from a child in Frankfurt just learning his own maternal German language. And this is the reason why you cannot decide that in a situation like that, logic would be separating you instead of connecting you. I will now conclude. The conclusion of the whole development of Quine around this notion of shared logic and the condition of translation and the ethics of translation consisting in believing in a shared logic between the radical translator and the native leads to this point, which is a beautiful sentence that I would like to quote. The logics of two cultures, says Quine, will be incommensurable at worst and never in conflict, since conflict would simply discredit our translation. This declaration is truly the point I want to make, and this is the point that speaks to me. Actually, my plan for the time being is to put it as an epigraph for what I plan to write after this, because it is the whole point. And this is something we probably need to hear in our time when the notion of a clash of civilization is so pervasive. That cultures, human cultures, as far as they are cultures, cannot be in conflict. Any appearance of conflict would mean that there is somewhere a bad translation. Now, this is the nice message from Quine. There is something still that remains, let me call it colonial, in Quine's example. Something which is missing in his thought experiment is any kind of agency coming from the native. The native does not participate in the elaboration of the manual of translation. It is as if he could not understand that the other person doesn't understand him. But what Quine said about empathy and about the fact that this transfers perfectly well in one's own maternal language should lead us to this idea that the native is perfectly familiar with misunderstanding. He can understand misunderstanding. So he could actually understand that he is misunderstood and work on that misunderstanding. Obviously, Quine, this would be, I would say this in bad faith, because he constructed his thought experiment for what he wanted to demonstrate. I am just the one being perverse here and saying, why isn't the native being more in command or more agent? Because again, this thought experiment is a colonial situation. And in colonial situation, translation goes just one way. And what my next lectures are going to address, hopefully, inshallah, would be translation going both ways and meaning reciprocity. Thank you very much.